There are conversations you'll never hear. Warnings passed quietly, not about what you've done, but about what follows you. Power doesn't introduce itself. It doesn't explain. It moves through memory, through lineage, through patterns people learn to recognize long before you arrive. Somewhere, an internal alarm went off in someone who's never met you. Not because of your actions, but because of what your presence implies. Fear doesn't always come from threat. Sometimes it comes from recognition, from the sense that something familiar, something inherited, has entered the room again. Bloodlines leave impressions. Reputations outlive moments. And while you've been living your life, unseen calculations have already been made. You didn't knock. You didn't announce yourself. Still, something in them tightened. The realization hasn't reached you yet, but it's close. Reputation is not what you announce. It's what accumulates when you're absent. It forms in the pauses between interactions, in how others retell your decisions, in what remains consistent when no explanation is offered. Long before you act again, an expectation has already been set. This is why reactions often feel disproportionate. Praise that seems unearned, resistance that feels sudden. The groundwork was laid quietly. Perception moves faster than correction because it doesn't wait for clarity. It fills gaps with assumption. And once that assumption hardens, your actual behavior becomes secondary. You are responding to something that's already in motion. What's unsettling is how little control this requires. You can be deliberate, measured, even restrained, and still be framed inaccurately. Not out of malice, but out of human pattern making. People need coherence. They need a narrative they can carry forward without revisiting the source. So they compress you. They reduce complexity into something portable. That version travels. It arrives ahead of you. And by the time you show up, you're stepping into a role that's already been cast. Power, then, is rarely granted at the moment of action. It's assigned in advance, based on perceived consistency. The person expected to lead is heard differently than the person expected to follow. The one assumed competent is forgiven before they err. The one labeled uncertain is questioned even when correct. These aren't conscious decisions. They're reflexes. Social gravity. Once a reputation stabilizes, it bends interpretation around it. Sane behavior can signal authority or insecurity, depending on what preceded it. This is why effort alone feels insufficient. You're not starting from zero. You're starting from an invisible balance sheet. There's a quiet conflict here that most people never resolve. The difference between who you believe you are and how you're already being read. Internally, identity feels fluid, nuanced, evolving. Externally, it's often fixed. This dissonance creates tension, the sense of being misunderstood, underestimated, or prematurely defined. And the instinctive response is to correct it loudly, to explain, to clarify, to perform harder. But explanation rarely outpaces reputation. It arrives too late and often sounds defensive, even when it isn't. What actually shapes perception is pattern density over time, not intensity, not moments of brilliance, but the quiet repetition of how you move when nothing is demanded of you. Reputation is built from what people can predict without checking. This is why silence can be more influential than speech, why restraint is often misread as indifference until it isn't, why absence used deliberately amplifies presence. When there's less data, people rely more heavily on the narrative they already have, and that narrative becomes self-reinforcing. There's also an uncomfortable freedom in realizing this. If reputation is already moving ahead of you, then chasing immediate validation becomes irrelevant. You stop performing for the room and start observing the current. You notice which spaces respond before you speak, which ones resist no matter what you say. Not as a judgment, but as information. Power isn't about controlling perception. It's about understanding where it's already settled. Over time, something shifts. You speak less, not because you have nothing to add, but because you recognize when addition changes nothing. You choose precision over volume, consistency over urgency, and slowly, without announcement, the narrative recalibrates. Not because you demanded it, but because you stopped interfering with it. Reputation, like gravity, responds to mass, not motion. In the end, the most influential version of you is rarely the one people encounter directly. It's the one that lingers after you leave, the one that speaks when you don't. And once you see that clearly, you stop trying to outrun it. You let it move, you let it settle, and you become very deliberate about what you leave behind. Families rarely pass down wisdom in clean sentences. What travels instead are patterns, subtle, unspoken, persistent. Ways of handling pressure, ways of withdrawing from conflict, ways of controlling or surrendering power. These behaviors don't announce themselves as inheritance. They feel like personality, but they are closer to reflex. A child watches how anger is expressed or avoided, how affection is rationed, how silence is used as punishment or protection. Over time, these observations harden into instinct, not because they are right, but because they worked once, somewhere, for someone. This is why bloodlines operate less like history books and more like behavioral maps. They don't tell you what happened. They show you how to respond when it happens again. The body remembers what the mind never learned. Tension rises in familiar moments. Voices lower. Distance forms. Control tightens. And the repetition continues. Not out of loyalty, but out of recognition. People are more perceptive than they admit. Certain traits trigger caution in others long before evidence appears. A familiar tone, a specific kind of confidence, a pattern of charm followed by withdrawal. Those who have lived inside similar systems sense the outline immediately. They don't know your story, but they recognize the shape of it. This is not intuition in the mystical sense. It's pattern recognition, experience noticing itself. That recognition explains reactions that feel disproportionate. Why trust is withheld without explanation. Why doors close quietly. Others aren't responding to who you believe you are in isolation. They're responding to what you resemble in motion. Bloodlines teach not only behavior, but how to read it. And when two maps overlap, history feels close. The uncomfortable realization comes slowly. History doesn't repeat because people are careless. It repeats because systems are efficient. What worked once becomes default. What kept someone safe becomes the template for safety. Even when the environment changes, the response remains. Generations later, the same strategies are deployed in rooms they were never designed for. Control where communication is needed. Silence where clarity would dissolve fear. Strength where vulnerability would end the cycle. Identity then becomes less about the present moment and more about position within a continuum. You are not just reacting to what is in front of you. You are completing a movement that began before you were aware. This doesn't remove responsibility, it reframes it. The self is no longer a single point in time, but a convergence of past decisions echoing forward. What shifts everything is not rebellion, but awareness. Not dramatic rupture, but quiet observation. When a pattern is seen clearly, it loses its invisibility. It no longer masquerades as fate or temperament, it becomes a mechanism. And mechanisms, once understood, reveal their limits. Some people sense this and choose distance. Others sense it and choose repetition. Neither path is loud. Both feel justified, but only one alters the map. The other preserves it with perfect consistency. Breaking a pattern doesn't require announcement. It happens internally, often without witnesses. A pause where reaction used to be automatic. A silence that isn't avoidance. A choice that feels unfamiliar because it belongs to no one before you. This is not reinvention. It is interruption. And once interrupted, the current changes. Not immediately, not cleanly, but enough to be felt. Enough that what follows no longer moves by default. By then, the past hasn't disappeared. It's simply no longer in control. And the future, for the first time, isn't repeating something it never chose. Fear is often misunderstood as a reaction to threat, to volume, to force. But beneath behavior, it tends to surface when predictability collapses, when patterns stop responding, when signals you rely on to measure your position, approval, resistance, escalation disappear. Aggression is readable. It follows rules. You know where you stand with someone who raises their voice or makes their intentions visible. The nervous system understands confrontation. It prepares, it braces, it adapts. Restraint, however, offers no such clarity. When someone doesn't react the way they're expected to, when they don't push back or comply, the mind loses its bearings. There's no feedback loop to confirm dominance or submission. Control becomes theoretical, and that uncertainty generates a quieter, deeper unease. Not because something is happening, but because nothing is. The absence of response removes the metrics people unconsciously use to orient themselves. Power, in that moment, becomes invisible, and invisibility unsettles. This is why silence carries disproportionate weight, not as a tactic, but as a condition. Silence denies the nervous system resolution. It interrupts the internal narrative that says, "I know what this means." Without external cues, attention turns inward. Thoughts accelerate. Imagined outcomes multiply. The fear isn't of what the other person might do, it's of what you can no longer confirm. And the mind, deprived of structure, fills the void with tension. Most people don't fear being challenged. They fear being unable to locate themselves within the interaction. When control works, it feels seamless. When it fails loudly, it still feels comprehensible. But when it fails quietly, the failure goes unnoticed at first. There's no signal to respond to, just a growing sense that the usual levers no longer move anything. That's when panic starts to form. Not as emotion, but as restlessness, a need to provoke clarity, to restore friction, to make something happen. This is why restraint often feels more destabilizing than confrontation. Confrontation validates the existence of a shared frame. It confirms engagement. Restraint withdraws that frame entirely. It forces awareness inward, where certainty is weaker. In that space, people confront an uncomfortable truth. Much of what they call confidence is actually calibration. It depends on reactions, on mirrors. When those mirrors are removed, identity wavers. The fear that emerges is not of loss, but of exposure to that wavering. What's revealed beneath this is not aggression, but dependence, a reliance on external markers to feel anchored. When those markers vanish, the self is left alone with its assumptions. Silence doesn't attack those assumptions. It simply refuses to support them. And in that refusal, instability becomes visible. The internal panic people experience isn't about the other person's power, it's about the sudden absence of their own reference points. This dynamic plays out everywhere. Conversations, negotiations, relationships, whenever control is expected but not confirmed. The moment someone cannot tell whether they are winning, influencing, or being seen, the system searches for ground. Fear is the signal that ground is missing. Not because danger is present, but because orientation is gone. And eventually something settles. Either the silence is broken, or it isn't. But the shift has already occurred. Once you've felt how fear emerges without force, how tension grows without conflict, the world recalibrates. You notice how much noise exists to prevent that feeling. How often volume is used to avoid stillness, and how power, at its quietest, doesn't announce itself at all. It simply remains unmoved. Authority that needs to be declared is still in negotiation. It depends on response. It waits to see if it will be accepted. That's why it raises its voice, sharpens its edges, repeats itself. It's trying to convince the room and often itself that it exists. But real authority moves differently. It doesn't ask for space, it assumes it. It doesn't explain consequences. It trusts that consequences are understood. This isn't bravado. 'Tis not dominance. It's an internal alignment, so complete that nothing leaks outward unnecessarily. People don't respond to what you say. They respond to what you don't need to say. Behind closed doors, this distinction becomes obvious. Warnings are rarely delivered to the person they're about. They're passed sideways, quietly. Someone leans in to tide forward. A name is mentioned. A sentence is shortened. Just be careful. That's it. No details. No drama. The message isn't informational, it's ancestral. It carries the weight of previous encounters, inherited caution, unspoken precedent. These warnings aren't about imminent danger, they're about recognition. A pattern has been identified, and the system adjusts itself accordingly. That's how real power travels, through memory, not performance. What's unsettling is realizing how little this has to do with action. We like to believe power is built through visible effort, through confrontation, strategy, force, but much of it is established long before any move is made. Presence alone can activate a response, not because you're doing something, but because you represent something. A certain density, a refusal to fragment. People sense coherence, the way animals sense weather. They don't analyze it, they react to it. And when they do, they often don't know why. This is where most misunderstandings happen. Someone assumes silence means weakness. They mistake restraint for absence. They believe that if no threat is issued, none exists. But silence isn't empty, it's loaded, especially when it comes from someone who doesn't need the room to agree with them. That kind of silence doesn't wait to be filled. It defines the space around it. Others begin to speak differently, act differently, hedge their behavior not because they were instructed to, but because something internal told them to recalibrate. There's a reason certain figures in history were described as heavy, even when they were calm. Not aggressive, not loud, heavy, as if gravity followed them. Gravity doesn't chase, it doesn't warn, it doesn't argue. It simply pulls, and everything nearby responds whether it wants to or not. This is existential gravity, the kind that comes from having resolved internal conflict. When there's no contradiction between who you are and how you move, others feel it immediately. Their nervous systems recognize the lack of friction. Most people spend years trying to manufacture this effect through external means, status, posture, language. But those are signals, not sources. They work briefly, then decay. Existential gravity doesn't decay because it isn't created for effect. It's the byproduct of integration, of having nothing to prove and nothing to hide. That's why threats become unnecessary. A threat implies uncertainty. It suggests you're not sure the boundary will hold without reinforcement. But when the boundary is structural, not behavioral, it doesn't need defending. The shift happens quietly, usually unnoticed by the person experiencing it. One day, conversations change. Not dramatically, just subtly. People explain less around you. They test less. They listen more carefully. You're not feared. You're accounted for. And that's a deeper form of recognition. It doesn't inflate the ego, because it isn't about admiration. It's about orientation. Others place you somewhere solid in their internal map, and once that happens, the dynamic settles. Nothing needs to be asserted at that point. Nothing needs to escalate. What already knows doesn't need reminding. It remembers on its own, and that memory does the work, slowly, quietly, without spectacle.